My name is Galen. I'm the Executive Director of Mass Bike with the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition. We do statewide work here throughout Massachusetts and sometimes and beyond with our federal partners. So again, we're interested in learning where you are dialing in from. So please let us know either via the chat or by renaming yourself where you're coming in from. And if you have any particular tips or tricks or hints or must-haves in terms of riding out there in the wintertime. This is going to be roughly an hour-long presentation. I'll try to keep it pretty tight so we can get to some questions and comments towards the end. And I'm going to preface this by saying that none of this is written in stone. This is not a must-do, a be-all, end-all for riding. I personally have been doing winter riding in Massachusetts since I came up here from Virginia about 2003 and 2004. So I had some pretty rude awakenings in terms of how to tackle the barriers, the cold, dark, and wet. And over the course of, I don't know, about 18 or so years, we've been crafting this presentation and always adding to it. So I'm going to certainly recommend that if you have your own tips, if you have anything that you feel is missing, if you have anything that either can add or counter some of the information here, we want to make this a little bit contributory, so please feel free to utilize the chat. But what we are going to cover, in my opinion, are the three barriers, which are the cold, dark, and wet. So how do we keep you warm? How do we keep you dry? How do we keep you lit? Since we have some board members here and some staff members here, remind you that Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition leans on the coalition nature of our work. We depend on you as advocates to keep us in touch with some of the local issues and some of the ways that we can help you in your riding. We do statewide work, which means we think big picture, we think legislation, we think policy, we think funding, but it all trickles down to your individual riding. So please do keep in touch. If you haven't already become a member, I recommend you go to massbike.org, check out our membership link. You can also check out some of the recent updates and recent news. We just had a major milestone piece of legislation signed 10 days ago. So there's lots going on with Mass Bike and our riding partners out there. So that's my little pitch. And please do check us out if you're new to the coalition. But today we're talking about winter riding. And today, as evidenced by outside this window here, we picked a perfect day to talk about how gross it can be and to do this over Zoom. So if you're here, if you're spending your lunchtime with me, probably don't need to go too much into the why we're doing this, but I do love this. This is a panel from Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes. For those of you who don't know Calvin and Hobbes, highly recommend checking it out. It was a daily comic strip in the funnies for a better part of 2 decades or so. And the dad was a, quote, cyclist, a big C cyclist. I put this out there as a little bit of tongue in cheek. Mass Bike does like to represent all riders. So you might not be ready to hit your optimal heart rate in the middle of a sleet storm. Totally cool. We are actually looking for wherever you are, we want to meet you. So we're going to be talking about some things today that are a little bit maybe advanced if you're new to riding, or something that's old hat if you've been doing this for a while. Because we're doing this virtually, we're hitting across the state, we're hitting across the spectrum. Some folks are new to riding, some folks have been doing this for a better part of several decades. I want to make sure I'm not either talking over or talking down to, so please feel free to add in. But I do want to preface anything that we're saying here. Chances are you can get through a winter with whatever you have in your closet. If you've lived in New England, if you've been through a winter in New England, if you've been able to walk, if you've been able to go out in the snow, if you've been able to drive, you have what you need, more or less, to get out. Maybe not every single day, but most of the days. And I personally have gone on this journey when I was an undergraduate with no money. You know, there was the time when I did not have the waterproof gloves, but I would go into a CVS and pick up a plastic bag to put over my socks, under my boots, to keep my feet dry. So depending on wherever you are, chances are you can still get out there and ride. Now that said, there are some certain tips to remind you about, mainly to battle the cold, the dark, and the wet. These are my 3 themes that we're going to be pushing throughout the course of today's talk. So we'll start with talking about bikes. Lots of different options, lots of different varieties. The bike that you have in your basement, in your garage, in your shed, on your bike rack is probably totally cool. If you have concerns around the performance of the bike, if you love this bike, if this bike is near and dear to you for sentimental or for cost reasons, you might think about getting a winter specific bike. I have a winter specific bike. I have it behind me. I'll talk about it in a moment. But before I get into that, let's talk about some of the varieties of bikes, just so we are all on the same page. Here's my basic commuter bike. Upright, the body is kind of up. You have the flat bars, kind of have a head on a swivel, 360 degrees. These are heavier bikes. These have gears. These have typically some fenders and racks. Good for toting around, for going that 5 to 10 miles if you're just cruising around town. Great bikes. Sometimes there's a little more complication to them in terms of the cabling, the gearing that you have to take some extra care for in the winter, but no worries if this is what you want to get out in, this is great. Or maybe you're a road biker. Fitness, distance, heart rate, this might be you. Road bikes, totally fine in the winter. Though their skinnier tires are good for performance on asphalt, when you're on slick pavement, sleet, it does make it a little more dodgy. So you might want to think about, tire size, tire width, and tire tread. But road bikes typically are narrower wheels, narrower clearance, so you can't get too wide. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you've got a road bike and you want to take it out in the winter, totally great. You can go for it. You can go enjoy yourself. Mountain bikes, these are kind of made for the dodgy, the tread needing, the digging into dirt, the digging into slush, the digging into snow. Mountain bikes are great for a couple of reasons. One, shorter wheelbase, and by that I mean the front wheel to rear wheel are a little bit closer together, so it's a little easier to whip around. Maybe not as efficient in terms of where your body is at, in terms of where you're upright, in terms of the ankle to knee to hip ratio. Don't need to get into fit, but we can. But mountain bikes typically are good because they're made for digging into dirt, also would be good for digging into slush. Or, if the pavement conditions to get to be a little bit more dodgy, then mountain bikes can, with the fatter tires, give you a little bit more cushion for when you're riding out there. Now, I should I should dive in here and mention that your bike might be a combination. It could be a combination of a hybrid of maybe a mountain bike tire with road bike brakes. Maybe it's an upright position, but you have like a little bit narrower wheels. Totally cool. This is a spectrum from which we're on, but just to give us a little bit of common terminology. But then you can go wacky. Then you can go with the folding bike. Now, folding bikes are great because they make basically all multimodal trips possible. You can take your bike in the trunk of a car. You can take your bike on any bus. You can take your bike on any commuter rail, on any RTA, on any T line without restrictions. If you are thinking about being multimodal, you might need to check with your train or your bus schedule to make sure it fits. But if you've got a folding bike, boom, you can take your bike with you at all points in time. Now, different varieties of folding bikes, different gearing systems, but typically they are made to be folded up and carried. And here's an example of former executive director Dave Watson taking his bike on the Green Line, which, for those of you in the Boston area know, that's a little bit of blasphemy, being able to take a bike on the Green Line, but not if it's a folder. And then the opposite end of the spectrum there, fat tire bikes. I love fat tire bikes because there's been a revolution in technology around fat tires. The bikes themselves are more accommodating. They're kind of like mountain bikes, but a little bit beefed up. We're talking 4-inch, 5-inch wide tires. These are made for riding on top of the snow. If you're going out there and it's been sleeting and snowing and then several times days off, it'll melt a little bit and then more snow, you'll get down into snowpack. It's really hard if you've got narrower wheels to cut through the snowpack sometimes. But if you've got a fat tire bike, just like a mountain bike, but this is even better because you can actually kind of coast on top. For those of you in the coastal areas, fat tire bikes are also great because you can ride them on the sand. So even during the warm season, these are awesomely functional to get you out riding where otherwise bikes would not really be permitted. And it's just kind of a new variety, a growing variety to add to kind of the mountain bike, the natural trail surface type of riding. Definitely different qualities. I'm showing the Mongoose here. It's kind of a cheaper bike, but you'll see it even has disc brakes in it. Whatever you need to do to kind of get out and ride, your bike is fine. But also when you think about if you're going to get a winter specific bike, you might think about it being a relatively cheaper bike because we'll talk about this a little later in the presentation, the salt and sand from the winter can wreak havoc on your componentry. So you might want to take a bike share bike, because who's in charge of the maintenance on a bike share bike? Not you. Who's in charge of locking up and making sure that that bike rack is clear and not piled in snow? Not you. The idea of having a bike share bike is that you are part of a multi-thousand bike system, assuming that your community partakes in bike sharing and it's expanding, whether you're in the Pioneer Valley or out in the Boston region or maybe back into Worcester soon. You will find that bike share is a potential to get out and ride. And personally, on the really gross days, I will actually hop a bike share bike so that I don't have to worry about maintenance on my own personal one. Cool. And then as a caveat, all types of bikes that we've just gone through can also be electric bikes. You can have an electric assist folding bike. You can have an electric assist mountain bike. You can have an electric assist road bike or hybrid bike. And even some bike sharing systems, like in the Pioneer Valley, have electric assist bike share. I don't have a specific slide for it because e-bikes typically are all different varieties of bikes. But just so you know that if you're looking into e-bikes as a way of going further, going farther, kind of easing a little bit of that commute, you can look into e-bikes as your ideal as getting out and cruising. But there's so many different types of bikes out there. I'm interested in the chat. What have I missed? What types of bikes should we cover? We have a cargo bike with a kid seat at the top there. We have a basic single speed commuter bike, no fenders, but hopefully he's got brakes. We got somebody trudging out there on a hybrid bike and even a tall bike. So this is a slide to say that we love whatever bike you're choosing to take out there in the winter, and don't feel that you aren't able or allowed to partake in the beauty of winter riding. Anything that I've missed, throw it in the chat. What type of bike do you ride, especially in the wintertime? All right. So we've got a lot of different types of bikes. That's pretty obvious. But any of those bikes you might want to think about modifying. So certain modifications, whether it's a winter specific bike or your personal beloved bike, here are some tips. Definitely not must. Oh, gravel bike. Thank you, Mr. iPhone, Mrs. iPhone. The gravel bike is basically a road bike style, drop bars, efficient geometry, but with knobbier tires and perhaps a little bit beefier brakes so that it could take some mud and some dirt. Also known as a cyclocross bike. I really do love gravel bikes as well, especially for winter. Certain tips, again, these aren't musts, these are suggestions, but you can think about modifying your bike. If you have a bike that has clearance for wider tires, wonderful. That gives you a little bit more variety. You might think about changing out your pedals even so that they can take boots. Maybe you clip in, and that's great, but maybe you want to be riding in galoshes today. This is not exactly, I don't see any SPD clips on this thing. So you might want to think about getting some wider pedals. I like flat bars personally when I'm riding, especially in the winter, but you know, to each their own. But you are needing to consider what type of brakes you have, and whether it's and what type of shifters that you have. If you're able to even remove some of the componentry, make it a single speed or simplify your braking mechanisms, you will save yourself the trouble of having to replace components or worry about maintenance. And if you want to go so far as to change out your tires, I'll show you here. Pardon me for a moment. You can go ahead and get tires that have studs in them. It took me about 15 years of riding in Boston before I went and actually got metal studs. And I think it was the winter of 2015 that convinced me to do it, when we had 10 feet of snow and pack ice everywhere. But if you're interested in riding in the ice, 365, you might want to think about something that actually clutches and digs into the ice as an option where, you know, totally fine on those days that you don't ride. But they were a game changer for me because it was personally for me when I realized that I could ride in that if I did so choose. Cool. And I'm interested in what your favorite piece of bike modification is. And we're talking bikes here, not quite equipment. What have you done to your bike to make it winter specific. I'll take a moment here just to see what pops into the chat. Cool. And while we do this, I will throw this bike up for inspiration. 10 points to anyone who can guess whose bike this is. Or maybe I should say this was, because I believe he passed in 2009. This is a personal winter rider stolen from a internet web page. Certain things about this bike you can see, it's an old Bridgestone steel frame, heavy but bright, very reflective. Yeah, all right, Matt, this is Sheldon Brown's winter bike. For those of you who don't know Sheldon, he was the guru of bike mechanic everything. His website is the annuals and the archives of pretty much any and all of the nuances of getting into that, bearing size and getting into it. But, take some inspiration that his archive is still active and is still updated on the interwebs. And so certain things about Sheldon's bike, just for an example, he converted his bike into a fixed gear, which means it was a single speed in the rear, so no gear cluster, no derailleur, no cabling. And that was able to, when you're pedaling forwards or backwards, you have a direct connection, so there's no coasting. You can see that he has wide tires. I'm going to assume that there are studs on this one, although I don't know, but there are fenders. You can see that he's upright when he was riding. He was not down in a gravel bike or a road bike position. He's a big guy, or was a big guy, so this is kind of a narrow wheelbase for him, able to whip around a little bit. Big, bright light in the front. I imagine that's probably about 15,000 lumen light. He's got a rear pannier bag for carrying rags, extra clothes, etc. And anything else that I've missed on there, but this is just an inspiration if you want to go so far. And my hunch is that he found this bike in the back of Harris Cyclery for free and just modified it. So yeah, so there you go. Just some inspiration for you. Great, and thanks to everyone in the chat who's chiming in. I'll try to read through them and respond as needed, but I'm seeing some hydraulic brakes. Those are great because there's no way for the cable system to rust up if you are out in the cold. Doug's got bar mitts. He loves his bar mitts. Waterproofing of panniers. That's a clever one. Was that like a coating that you put on the panniers, or was it maybe a bag system? I'm curious as to how you waterproofed your pannier, Brett.
It's probably not super kosher, but the hardware store just sold like a cheap spray you could put on fabric. So that worked.
Awesome. Cool. I love it. And like I said, DIY it, whatever gets you through. You don't need to go high end if you don't want to. Cool. All right, so that's the bike. I'll pause here for a second. This is a big one. Modifying a bike really is important because it will allow you safety, because it'll allow you traction and allow you ability to ride on sometimes slick or snowy conditions. It's also key in terms of body geometry. You want to make sure that you are injuring yourself. If you're going to be pushing yourself in the cold conditions, it's a different type of body-mind system. So keep that in mind, make sure it's comfortable for you. And a little bit about my bike here. See if I can get out of the way. This is a mixed frame, basket in the front, got a nice bell. So I can get absolutely key for when I'm out there in the bike path. I have big fat platform tires for my boots, like I was mentioning. And I'll also mention I put these nice little reflective stickers on that you can see that really go a long way into making my bike pop whenever I'm out there in traffic. Cool. All right, so you've got your bike. What are the must-haves along with the bike? Your accessories are up to you, except for you really ought to have a helmet, a lights, and a lock. Now, helmets, obviously, not going to belabor the point. If you're here, you're probably smart, probably wear a helmet. It's wonderful. But keep in mind that your helmet will change depending on what type of hat you might be wearing. So like if I'm putting on my knit hat here, I'm going to need to readjust all of my straps. And then, I've got this really ventilated, lightweight system for my helmet. I might want to tape up these holes if I'm going out there in the cold, but you do you. Little thing about the helmet though is I always got to remind folks, if your helmet is old in terms of 5 years or older, it's probably compromised. The styrofoam breaks down, the plastic breaks down. Go ahead and get a new helmet. You might even want to get a winter specific one if you're going to go so far. And if you've ever been in a crash and hit your head, or if you've ever had a helmet drop from a height, inspect it, look for cracks. Helmets are one-time use devices, which means that if you've been in some sort of impact, it's designed to break apart. And if your helmet is cracked or compromised, get a new one. Don't play around with it. Your brain is too important. I always feel like I should mention that. Lights, you can never really go wrong with having 2 mini lights out in the wintertime, especially with visibility at a premium when drivers are out there with foggy mirrors and foggy windshields and sleet coming down. You want to make sure that you are as bright and lit as possible. Mass Bike does hand out lights, part of our Lights Brigade program. If you want a set of lights, let us know. We'll mail them to you. If you want to stand outside your local bike path and hand out lights on behalf of Mass Bike and your local advocacy org, go to our Lights Brigade page on massbike.org. We have a new order up. We have 2,000 lights that we just got in from Delta. So please give us a ring. We will send you some lights if you promise to hand them out in your community, part of our Lights Brigade. And then a lock. It's up to you what kind of lock you really want to use, but I do recommend getting a nice thick steel U-lock because they cannot be cut with the cable cutters, and just goes a little bit further in terms of making sure your bike is around when you come back to pick it up. These are the must-haves. Additional ones, we talked about modifying the bike, but you also might want to bring a rag with you in the wintertime to wipe down your brakes. You might want to bring a bottle of water, a thermos for something warm in case you're going to be going long distance, you need to warm up. And then whatever you can do to also make yourself reflective sides on the wheels also goes a long way. What might you bring? And I'll throw this back in the chat if you want to chime in about some of the personal gear that's an addition to the bike and the equipment that you bring with you in the wintertime to make sure that your ride is a comfy ride. Cool. So let's talk visibility. This one's key. And I don't know the kind of provenance or the truthfulness of this infographic here in terms of how far drivers can see you based on what your clothing is. But this is a reference point. For those of you who love high vis green, wonderful. Keep that up. Keep in mind that the outer layer and the bike itself is what is most visible. So as we talk about layering for clothing, you want to think about what is the last point of reference between me and a driver's eyes. And this is also to mention that when you are riding out there, you need to change your technique and be as predictable as possible. Hand signals, lane positioning, make yourself prominent and visible, which is especially important in the wintertime as the sides of the road become blocked with snow and ice. You're going to need to be more prominently placed within the travel lane, which means you have to be seen and known. Be high vis. Cool. Also curious, what kind of reflectivity and what kind of lights do you get off that? Again, the 3 barriers we're tackling here, the cold, the dark, and the wet. The dark is actually very easily combated, but you just got to keep in mind from the perspective of a driver and put yourself into their position. Cool. All right, so you got the bike, you got the gear, you got the mindset, you've got to keep yourself maintained. This slide I use in almost all my commuting presentations. This is the basics, the ABCs of bike maintenance. We have a whole hour-long webinar on YouTube on our Mass Bike page if you want to kind of get more in the nitty-gritty about checking for air pressure, tightening the barrel adjuster, getting to know your chain, et cetera, et cetera. But just to know the ABCs, air brakes, chain. This is on you. Now, hopefully you've got a great relationship with your bike shop. You've got mechanics that you can turn to if you're hearing a rattle or something is squeaking or something feels a little bit off. But on literally a daily basis, on a every single ride basis, you'll need to make sure that your tires are properly inflated. And if they're not, you got to pump it up. You got to make sure that your brakes are nice and tight. And if not, you're going to need to mess with the barrel adjusters and check the brake pads to make sure that there's clearance and that they're actually making connection with where they're needing to stop. And you'll need to make sure your chain is in good condition. Very, very easy, but if you're unfamiliar with it, as I was when I first started biking, you're likely to ride on a flat tire and potentially ruin a wheel. Have brakes that aren't connected, and you only come to figure it out when you're trying to do a stop and you can't, and then you panic. Or your chain is so worn out, so rusty, and so weak that when you pedal, the chain snaps on you and you can even buck yourself off your bike. Honestly, it's happened to me. I learned to do the ABCs based on mistakes that I have made. Now, literally, I just squeeze my tires. I will check my brakes. And I will pedal backwards a little bit to make sure that my chain is in good condition. And about probably in the wintertime, every 3 or so weeks, I will go for cleaning. But in the regular season, every 6 to 8 weeks, I'll go ahead and clean and lube my chain. And I ride at least a little bit every day. So I'm depending on this machine to not just get me there, but also to get me home. Now, your bike is going to have specific issues in terms of where quick release levers might be, where bolts you need to check. If you have a rack or fenders that you put a lot of stress on, make sure that you're checking those bolts pretty regularly. Just the basic maintenance that you should get comfortable with and getting to know. And if you don't know, wonderful. Go to your local bike shop, ask around, go to your local bike co-op, or get in touch with Mass Bike, and maybe we can help you out. Cool. But the winter specific, the be all end all is know your enemies. Salt and sand will destroy your components. This is the big challenge that you're constantly out there fighting, because you want the cities and towns to treat the streets. You want them to clear the roads, but all of that gunk and all of that grit mixes with the oils, with the metals, and gets really dug into the delicate nature of specifically the drivetrain, where the pedals and gears and chain ring are, but throughout the whole bike, and also on the brakes, because as you brake, you collect all of the gunk and it gets caught between the brake pad and the rim. So if you're not doing your due diligence to keep that clean and clear, you do run the risk of either prematurely wearing out your pads or your rim, or you get to the point where you can't stop because you don't have good contact between the brake pad and the rim. So knowing your enemy is salt and sand, what should you really do? Now, very basic, easy stuff. This is one of my favorites, called Green Fizz. The product by Pedros, which is a Haverhill-based bike company. Most of their stuff is biodegradable. I love it. Pedros doesn't you think that's great? Get some simple green from the store, dilute it with some water, get some loose solvent, just a little bit of a degreaser into some water, and try to wipe down where that grit is collecting. Specifically where the brakes, where the mechanism of the brakes are, and also where the drivetrain is. Secondly, you might want to invest in some nice chain lube. Got a couple of examples here, the drip kind or the spray kind. Whatever it is, make sure it's bike specific. Not motor oil, not for a motorbike. WD-40 is not a lubricant. It stands for water displacement. It is a solvent. It's really good at getting that rust off, but it does not put anything in its place. So you're going to want to do your due diligence of making sure that any exposed metal, any exposed springs, any exposed cabling has a little bit of grease on it every so often to keep it from rusting up. And then lastly, one of my favorite nifty little tools is just some isopropyl alcohol. This is for your brakes and your rims. I would wipe down my brakes, my brake pads with isopropyl alcohol, and my rims because it evaporates without leaving a residue. The trouble with something like Green Fizz, this is good about getting grease off, but it does leave a little bit of a coating. Whereas this isopropyl alcohol, the cheap stuff, usually I get 70% because it doesn't evaporate as quickly, but just a little bit of rubbing alcohol and a clean rag goes a long way into making sure that your brakes get that oil and grease off, and that improves the traction of the pad as it connects to the rim. Now, if you have disc brakes, and a lot of winter bikes out there are disc brakes, a lot of mountain bikes are disc brakes, a lot of fat tire brakes are disc brakes. The only thing you should use on your rotors of your disc brake is rubbing alcohol. You can get disc brake cleaner, just it's the same stuff, but don't use a solvent. Don't use a grease. Really only something that will evaporate and leave no residue whatsoever. And for something like brakes, you don't want to mess around. If you compromise the pads of your disc brakes, you got to get new pads. There's no way to clean off the pads if they get compromised with oil and grit. So again, really is just doing your due diligence. Now, this is a little tricky. I'm in my sunroom right now, which I don't really want to get too muddy. We do call it our mud room. We do have little places for our boots, but you want to find a place in your home where you can kind of get a little muddy. You can kind of get a little greasy, you can kind of get a little wet. So whether this is in the backyard, whether this is in the basement, or whether this is somewhere before you bring it inside. I do recommend bringing your bike in whenever you can, because if you let that salt and sand kind of wash away and melt away, you can clean it a little bit easier. But that said, not everybody has the ability to bring a bike inside. So find a nice spot where you can actually get a little bit of the grease and the mud off your bike somewhere that is clean. Not to challenge you there, it could be just as easy as brushing it off with a small broom before bringing it inside. But whatever you can do just to kind of get that prep work done. And if you can bring your bike indoors at all, I do recommend in the winter because that allows that salt and sand to kind of melt away, and then you have an easier time washing it off with something like the Fizz. Cool. What have I missed? Any tips that you might want to share about winter maintenance specific? Again, just avoid that rust, avoid that salt, and avoid that sand. Cool. All right. So cold. You know, the three barriers again: cold, dark, and wet. Cold and wet can be countered both with clothing. Lots of different options for clothing. Like I mentioned at the beginning, whatever you have in your closet, if you've survived a New England winter, you're probably fine. But I do want you to think about layers, but also where will you be 10 minutes into your ride? Will you have climbed a hill? Will you be exerting a lot of energy? Will you be burning calories? If you're new to winter riding, one of the tips that I always hear from people is how easy it is to overheat. And overheating becomes a problem out there because it actually impacts how your brain and your body connect and how that kind of subconscious communication happens. You're going to need a little bit of ventilation. You're going to need an ability to kind of open up your shirt a bit, maybe have zips for your armpits if you've got a coat, or pull over and actually take off a layer or two and cool yourself down if you're finding yourself overheating. This is the biggest tip that most people don't realize if they're new to riding, because when they walk, when they are huffing to the bus or they're riding in a car, they don't really think about all the calories that could be burned when you're riding a bike. So keep that in mind. You can also think about layering in terms of what I like to call the hiker's guide, where cotton is not your friend. Now, cotton as a base layer absorbs sweat, absorbs heat, and actually gets damp. And if you're out there in really cold temperatures, that can actually turn frigid and frankly, a little bit dangerous. So I recommend if a base layer, if you want to go so far as to having a wicking, whether that's wool, whether that's a synthetic, to allow your body to breathe a little bit more. Now, everybody's a little different. When I'm riding into the office, from my house to the office, it's like 5 miles. I'll ride in cotton. It's no problem. But if I'm really going out there, and I'm not a very sweaty person personally. I'm lots of other types of people, but to each their own. You'll have to find whatever fits your needs. So cotton can be okay, but just know that it's going to have a harder time of breathing than you would if you were in wool or synthetic. And then lastly, we have here this nifty little guide in terms of base layer, mid-range layer, insulation layer, and outer layer. Depending on the heat, depending on the cold, depending on the wet, you're going to want to change what your outer layer might be and what your insulation layers are. So I've got some tips here to share. And layering is the key. So personally, I find that my fingers and toes get a little bit chillier sooner. So I do a lot of base layering for gloves. This is a nice, $20 set of merino wool base gloves, and slide these on nice and easy. Now, these won't do anything on their own, but if I combine this with, say, a lobster mitt, and this is one of my favorites, these are like you're a Ninja Turtle or Spock, you're three-fingered, which allows the buddy system of my two fingers to kind of keep each other warm, still allows me full functionality to hit the brakes and shift as needed. This is one of my favorite little pieces of clutch clothing that I did pay for. And it's got a little bit of reflectivity on it. The lobster mitts go a long way. But again, having a lobster mitt coupled with a base layer is great. Similarly, I've gone so far as to, even in the on season when it's wet, I've got some waterproof gloves. This is from a company called Showers Pass. Arguably, they're a little pricey, but I've got a pair. The beauty of these are, though they don't allow you to breathe, they're kind of like, it's like a plastic coating inside of it and on the outside. So it actually is a waterproofing, which is kind of nice because, again, we're kind of trying to combat the wet as well. For jackets and clothes, I mean, I'm wearing cotton now, which is probably totally fine, but I'll probably do some layering. A nice poofy jacket goes a long way. And then the outer layer, depending on if it's cold and wet, I'll probably do a nice rain shell. This is just a bright green shell of a coat. It's got no insulation in it whatsoever. But if I'm layering under it, I'm basically doing that job for me. And this is the outer layer. The beauty of having good rain gear, doubling as good winter gear, is that it keeps you dry and it also keeps the wind out. So it is a nice added benefit. And I do recommend, if you can get bicycling specific gear, it's great because it's got reflectivity built into it. But I do recommend whatever outer layer you're wearing really has to be bright and visible. And if it's not, try to make it bright and visible. Try to attach some reflectivity to it. Try to attach something bright. Remember that it doesn't do you any good if you're wearing a bright green underlayer and then you throw on a gray rain pants. You really got to make yourself as visible as possible. And then on a day like today, where it's actually actively sleeting outside, I might wear goggles. These are just simple Home Depot goggles that I have for home projects, but ski goggles work really well. Something that if you're actually getting out there, because the active precipitation in my eyeballs, not very pleasant. Little extra bits of reflectivity here. This is a leg band. These are great because I can put it around my rain pants or around my ski boots, and it adds a little bit of brightness to it. This is from Bay State Bike Month 3 years ago. Maybe you've got one of these relics. And let's see, what else might I have? I mentioned about plastic bags over boots earlier in this talk. You can also go and get specific booties as rain covers for your cycling shoes or your boots as well. But more often than not, I ride in galoshes. If I was going out today and I just put on these rain boots, does my feet wonders. So that's like some of the tips. There's plenty that are out there. And I just kind of strewed a whole bunch around without any rhyme or reason. So I'm just kind of picking up what I'm seeing around me. I also like these buffs that are lovely. Maybe you're a mass bike supporter and got one of these buffs. The beauty of these buffs is that they're really versatile. You can wear it as head covering, which is easy to fit under your helmet. Or if it's really cold, you can pull it down in terms of a balaclava style, kind of do some good protection. If it's getting a little warmer, pull it down and just cover the neck. These buffs, I think, are one of my favorite pieces of winter gear. And maybe you're a mass bike supporter and have one of these, that's great. And if you're so genetically able or hormonally able to grow a beard in the winter. It actually keeps that ice off the skin. So these are just some tips, stuff that I've learned over the course of 10 years out there in New England winters on a bike. Plenty more where that came from. Again, whatever fits you the best. Keep in mind, fingers, toes, outer layers, reflectivity, and waterproofing, along with proper layering. Cool. That was a hodgepodge and a slew. I'm curious as to what you might do. All right, let's move on. In the last few minutes, let's talk a little bit about practicalities of winter riding when you're out there in the real world. First off, know where you're going to end your ride. Unfortunately, most bike racks are positioned in places that become snowed in and plowed in. So maybe you want to do a little bit of due diligence to find the indoor locations to leave your bike in a spot that is protected from the elements. Not always possible. Sometimes you do have to lock it up to a parking meter. Now, if that's the case, it's actively snowing, you need to make sure that you're not in the way of the snow plows, because I guarantee you the snowplow driver does not give two concerns about your bike being there, and you might get a tacoed wheel. It happens. And then in all considerations, if you're ever leaving your bike outside, you have to make sure that you are not blocking a right of way. You are not blocking handicap access for somebody in a wheelchair. You are not blocking a fire escape. You are not blocking an exit or a sidewalk. So this may change where you typically park your bike. If you're used to doing it in the most convenient of ways, locking it to the front door, you might need to think a little bit beyond and be a little bit of just a little coherent and aware of the surroundings out there. For your own benefit, I recommend getting a nice little saddle bag. Again, plastic bags work great. Keep your bike from, keep your seat from getting wet in the active sleet and snow and rain. I'll just leave these tips there. You can also think about multimodal commuting, not just your end of trip destination, but how are you going to get there? You don't need to ride the whole way. On a day like today, when it was a little bit nicer in the morning, I could have ridden to work and maybe I would have taken a bus home, knowing that I can take my bike on the bus. Or maybe I would have bike shared it, so I could have done a one-way trip. Whatever you might need to do, you just might need to think about riding both directions during active precipitation. That's up to you. Always a choice. But get to know your routes, get to know your RTAs, get to know your schedules, and know that bikes are not allowed on every route at all times a day. For instance, in the T system, on the commuter rails, you are not allowed to take your bike on the busy peak directions during busy peak times, which is the morning rush and the afternoon commute when you're coming into the city and that exodus. And if you're in the T subways, you can't do it between 7 and 10 in the morning and 4 to 7 in the evening. Just keep that in mind. All buses on the MBTA system, except the ones that go through tunnels, have bike racks, except they only take 2 bikes per rack. So keep that in mind as well. You might need to wait for a bus or two in case that bike is that rack is filled. But be flexible, make sure that you're not in a rush, and just kind of be patient out there, because we all have to be when we're sharing the roads. You're going to want to think about planning your route. Your route will change depending on the weather. Now, you might love to ride the Charles River pathway, but if you've got 8 to 10 inches of snow, it's probably not passable. That means you probably need to be out in the roadways. If you're not comfortable in the roadways, or certain roadways, you might need to think about changing your route. 2 examples here. I have the city of Cambridge's bike plan up, a little outdated. They've expanded the network since, but that said, the network is only as good as the best plowed of the roads, or maybe the worst plowed of the roads. So typically, even on a protected bike lane network, you still might find yourself riding in traffic. And for those of you who are zooming in who have no protected bike lane network, because that's most of Massachusetts, you're going to need to think about what roads get cleared first, and choose your route accordingly. If you're okay riding on ice and snow, sticking to the secondary roads might be fine, but otherwise you might find yourself on the arterials, where I would normally avoid, because there's buses and trucks and taxis and pedestrians and all the other complications of riding in an urban or even semi-urban environment. You might need to think about, well, did they plow Pearl Street, or am I going to have to take Mass Ave again? Just be flexible and know that that's just part of the equation. But your technique will change. One of my mentors in this, Jessica Mink, would say technique is as important as equipment. If you're going to be a winter rider, technique is as important as equipment. Now, if we were in person, I would ask us to go around, and maybe we can do this over Zoom. Give me a thumbs up if you've ever slipped walking in the wintertime. If you've ever been out walking and you've ever slipped on any ice. Or if you're a driver out there, have you ever been driving your automobile and had it slide out a little bit in the snow? Don't be surprised if a similar situation needs to occur when you're biking. Now, when you're biking, obviously you're much lower weight, you have more control, you can react more accordingly. But just to know that it is expected that you are going to slide around a little bit. So some tips in order to avoid some of the crashes are really be as predictable as possible. And by that, I mean, try to take the lane, try to be somewhere prevalent, try to be somewhere where you're not adjacent and next to traffic, but you are part of it. You're going to want to slow down on turns. You might be used to banking into a turn to preserve that momentum. You might be used to a little counter steering. You will need to steer more than lean on the roads. And that is an entirely different technique. And if it's new to you, I kind of recommend going to a parking lot on a snowy day and actually sliding around a little bit. Get used to what it feels like to slip. Get used to what it feels like to kind of lose your traction and need to catch it. If you get familiar with that, you'll kind of subconsciously and inherently learn how to react and respond just in case you do end up losing traction. You might want to lower your center of gravity. You might want to lower your seat an inch or two, which kind of compacts your center of gravity and makes it a little bit easier to handle, so that if you do slip, you're closer to put your foot on the ground to catch yourself, and you have a little bit more control on the turns. And getting down to ride defensively, this is be predictable, be patient, think of yourself as being part of traffic and not necessarily competing with or being against traffic. You need to be with the flow. That's going to lead me to one of my final slides, which is be empathetic. Keep in mind that you are not alone out there. One of the key words in sharing the road is that it is shared. I always like to say that all traffic is a negotiation. You are negotiating with all the other drivers out there how you are handling yourself safely. From a driver's point of view, think of yourself out there. Snow on the hood, fog on the mirrors and the windows. You're looking for other vehicles with lights on. So even though it might not be dark, if you're a cyclist, you want to have bright and flashing lights so that you are catching the eye of the drivers. There is no room for a bike lane. Maybe there's a bike lane on the street, but who knows, right? You're going to need to be riding in the tracks, which is totally fine. You'll just need to be communicating as a cyclist to the drivers behind you. If you're a person on a bike, you need to make sure that they know you're a person on a bike. And if you're a driver, you need to be communicating with that person on a bike ahead of you so that there is not this idea to jockey in front. There's lots of hand signals, and I mean the good hand signals, the waving, the smiling, the eye contact, to make sure that we're all in this together. Because honestly, there is no room to go side by side on a street like this. This is just an example to say, think of yourself in their position so that we can all understand that we are in a system and a negotiation because we are sharing the roads together. Cool. And along those lines, I keep these slides up for all my presentations. I'm going to fly through them just so I don't belabor the point, but tips and tricks for riding in traffic. Go the same direction as traffic. Unless it's a specific contraflow bike lane, go the same direction. Drivers are expecting you to be going the same direction as all traffic. Make sure those drivers are knowing that you are there. When you choose your line, make sure you're choosing that line outside of the door zone. I tried to find a winter specific door zone picture, but this one's going to do just fine. Keep in mind the door zone is some of the biggest dangers that's out there. Still a problem in the wintertime, especially when windows and mirrors are fogged up. Keep yourself, even if there's a bike lane, keep yourself about 3 to 4 feet away from all parked cars, just in case a passenger or a driver steps out. This is a serious one, especially in urban environments. Think about how you're going to handle left turns. Most crashes do happen at intersections. You can think about box turning. You can think about walking your bike. But more than anything, make sure you're communicating your intentions when you're out there. These are evergreen slides. I just like to have them up in all of my presentations. And then also a major challenge out there are the right hooks. This is certainly important in the wintertime as we are finding that as snow plows pile up snow at the corners of intersections, there's a concept called a sneck down. I won't get into it now, but it's when plows basically just plow where the cars are traveling. And all the extra space, which is usually for pedestrians or people on bikes, really is just ending up as snow storage. That puts you a little bit more at a disadvantage in terms of where the space is at. If I were this biker, if I were this person in the blue, I would probably signal, make eye contact, communicate with both the driver in the blue car and behind me in the beige car, if I could get their eye, and merge in the line of traffic and be in the line as opposed to parallel to avoid the right hook. And again, I won't get too much into this. This is a whole presentation in itself, but just a reminder of avoiding the right hook at intersections. Best way to handle this by being in the same line of traffic. But to recap the winter specific, it's pretty simple. It's pretty easy. And I know I flew through a lot of information from bikes itself, to the clothing, to the styles of riding, to commuting tips, to just the basics of combating the cold, the dark, and the wet.